It started with a courtroom so silent you could hear the click of a pen. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, known for her fiery personality and fearless tone, stood tall at the witness table. Cameras were rolling, journalists were typing furiously, and the air was thick with tension. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting to see what she'd say next. Across from her sat Judge Edith Jones, a woman of authority, calm but sharp, with decades of legal experience and an unshakable reputation for discipline. She was the kind of judge whose presence demanded silence. Her words were law inside that room, and few ever dared to challenge her. But Jasmine wasn't just anyone. She had built her career by standing up to power, by asking the questions others were afraid to ask. That day wasn't supposed to be personal. It was just another congressional hearing about justice and accountability. But as soon as Jasmine began speaking, everyone could tell this was going to be different. Her voice was steady, confident, and filled with conviction. "Your Honor," she began, "our justice system cannot expect respect from the public if it fails to show fairness in return." A few people in the audience nodded quietly. Her words carried truth, but also an edge, the kind that made those in authority shift uncomfortably. Jasmine continued, pointing out inconsistencies, calling out what she believed was hypocrisy within the courts. She wasn't there to pick a fight. She was there to make a point. But her tone, her confidence, it was too much for some to handle. Judge Jones folded her hands, listening intently. Her face gave nothing away, but her eyes told a different story, irritation mixed with disbelief. To her, Jasmine's boldness felt like a challenge to the system she had spent her life defending. When Jasmine finished speaking, the courtroom fell into silence. For a moment, all that could be heard was the hum of the air conditioner and the distant clicking of cameras. Then, Judge Jones leaned forward, her voice low but sharp enough to slice through the silence. "Miss Crockett," she said, "perhaps if you showed a little more respect and a little less attitude, people might actually listen to your point." The words hit the room like a slap. Gasps echoed. A few reporters stopped typing. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Jasmine's face as the sting of the remark sank in. She didn't move. She didn't blink. For several seconds, no one spoke. The air grew heavy. It was as if time itself had paused, waiting for her response. Everyone expected Jasmine to snap back. After all, she was known for her quick wit and fiery comebacks. But what she did next surprised everyone. She took a slow breath, then exhaled calmly. Her expression softened, but her eyes stayed firm, unwavering, confident. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even gentle, but filled with meaning. "Your Honor," she began, "respect isn't about silence. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it makes others uncomfortable." A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Jones blinked, caught slightly off guard by the grace in her tone. Jasmine continued, "I was raised to speak up when something is wrong, not to stay quiet because someone might take offense. I don't mean to show attitude, I mean to show courage. And if that makes people uncomfortable, maybe that says more about them than it does about me." You could feel the shift in the room. What had begun as tension was now transforming into admiration. Even some of the people who had doubted her before were nodding silently, recognizing the strength it took to stay calm under that kind of pressure. Judge Jones stared at her for a moment, expression unreadable. Then she sat back slowly, saying nothing. For the first time that day, she seemed unsure how to respond. The hearing resumed, but the energy in the room had completely changed. Jasmine's composure had turned a moment of humiliation into one of power. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't argued, she had stood her ground with dignity. By the time the session ended, the clip was already circulating online. Millions watched it. The tense exchange, the insult, and the way Jasmine handled it with poise and confidence. Comments flooded social media. She turned disrespect into power. That's how you handle authority, with grace. She didn't need to shout. Her silence spoke louder than anything. Later, as she walked out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed around her. Someone shouted, "Miss Crockett, what do you think about Judge Jones' comment?" She stopped, smiled slightly, and said, "People can insult your tone, your passion, or your attitude, but they can't silence your truth." And with that, she walked away, head high, leaving the crowd speechless. That moment, that calm, fearless response became more than just a viral clip. It became a symbol of strength, of how real power doesn't come from shouting louder than others. It comes from standing taller than hate. In that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She reminded everyone watching that respect isn't demanded, it's earned through courage, conviction, and calmness when the world tries to shake you. The remarks spread like wildfire online. Within minutes, the clip was trending on every major social media platform. News anchors, influencers, and talk shows couldn't stop replaying it. Some people called Judge Edith Jones's comment rude, unprofessional, and outdated. Others argued that Jasmine Crockett needed to tone it down and show more respect. The internet was split right down the middle. But those who truly knew Jasmine Crockett knew one thing. She wasn't the kind of woman who let insults go unanswered. She was confident, composed, and always in control of her emotions, no matter how heated things became. That day in the courtroom, everyone waited, almost holding their breath, to see how she would respond. The room was silent enough to hear the faint hum of the air conditioner and the clicking of cameras in the back. Every reporter, every observer, and even the judge herself seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Jasmine looked down for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Then, instead of snapping back, instead of meeting harshness with harshness, she did something that no one expected. She took a slow breath, adjusted her glasses, and offered the smallest, calmest smile. Her expression wasn't of anger. It was strength wrapped in grace. When she finally spoke, her tone was steady, clear, and measured. "Your Honor," she began softly, "respect isn't about silence. It's about standing firm when the truth makes people uncomfortable." The room shifted instantly. A quiet murmur spread among those seated behind her. Some reporters looked up from their notepads, surprised. Even Judge Jones, known for her composure, raised an eyebrow, her stern expression flickering for just a moment. Jasmine wasn't done. She continued, her voice rising just enough to carry across the courtroom. "I was raised to speak up when something's wrong, even if it makes others uneasy. Attitude isn't disrespect, it's passion. And if passion for justice bothers anyone here, then maybe that says more about them than about me." The room went silent again, but this time it wasn't the awkward, heavy silence that follows tension. It was thoughtful, the kind of silence that forces people to reflect. You could almost see the shift in the faces of those watching. What had started as a confrontation was quickly turning into a moment of revelation. Judge Jones leaned back slightly in her chair, studying the young Congresswoman in front of her. She had seen countless people crumble under pressure in her courtroom. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't crumbling. She wasn't defensive or disrespectful. She was calm, articulate, and powerful in her restraint. It wasn't what the judge had expected, and it certainly wasn't what the cameras had come to capture. In the press section, one journalist whispered, "That's going viral." He was right. Within hours, clips of Jasmine's measured response would spread across the internet. Headlines would read, "Jasmine Crockett teaches a masterclass in grace under fire," and another, "She didn't just win the argument, she won respect." By evening, the moment had evolved beyond a viral clip. It had become a conversation about dignity, leadership, and what true respect looks like. For Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't about being right. It was about being real. Back in her hotel room that night, Jasmine sat quietly by the window, scrolling through the overwhelming wave of messages. She smiled, not because she'd gone viral, but because people were finally discussing something meaningful. For her, that was the victory. And somewhere, in her private chambers, Judge Edith Jones replayed the footage too.
this time not as a judge evaluating a witness, but as a woman recognizing another woman's strength. That day in court, two worlds collided: authority and audacity, tradition and transformation. And from that clash, something rare emerged: respect that wasn't demanded, but earned. It was the kind of moment that reminded everyone watching that real power doesn't always come from raising your voice. Sometimes it comes from lowering it and letting the truth speak for itself.
The news of the private conversation between Judge Edith Jones and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett spread quietly at first, whispered among reporters and hinted at by insiders, but within a few days, it was everywhere. What started as a fiery courtroom exchange had now transformed into something far more meaningful. And to everyone's surprise, people loved this new chapter even more than the dramatic clash that came before it. News anchors called it a moment of rare humility in modern politics. Commentators described it as the bridge between two generations of women who refused to be silenced. Across television networks, the story was no longer being told as a conflict, but as a connection, a symbol not of division, but of dialogue. Clips of both women began circulating side by side on social media. The moment Jasmine calmly stood her ground, and the quiet handshake that came after. People edited them together with captions like "Strength meets wisdom" and "Respect doesn't mean silence." The internet, so often a battlefield of opinions, was now united in admiration. For once, the conversation online wasn't about who won. It was about what both women represented. Jasmine Crockett became a symbol of fearless conviction, a reminder that standing firm in your beliefs doesn't require shouting. Judge Edith Jones became a model of humility and growth, proof that even those in power can listen, reflect, and change. Schools began discussing the exchange in debate clubs and civics classes. Teachers used it to show students that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. You can be passionate without being rude, and you can admit you're wrong without losing authority. Podcasts picked it up too. One popular show titled their episode "The Calm Storm: How Jasmine Crockett Redefined Professional Courage." Another episode focused on Judge Jones' reflection, calling her decision to meet privately with Jasmine a masterclass in leadership maturity. Even political analysts, usually the first to turn every story into a headline war, admitted that this one felt different. It wasn't about power. It was about perspective. In a rare move, Judge Edith Jones released a short written statement a few days later. It wasn't defensive, nor was it filled with legal jargon. It was simple, honest, and heartfelt. Leadership isn't about silence or shouting. It's about knowing when to listen and who deserves to be heard. Those words hit home for people across the country. Social media flooded with comments praising the judge's humility. One user wrote, "This is how you lead, with grace, not ego." Another said, "Both women showed us something we don't see enough anymore, respect that goes both ways." That single line, "knowing who deserves to be heard," was quoted everywhere. News outlets printed it in bold. Motivational speakers used it in seminars. It inspired thousands of people to rethink the way they approach disagreement in their own lives, at work, at home, and online. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett supporters flooded her social media pages with encouragement and admiration. They called her response the calmest storm ever seen in a courtroom. One comment read, "She didn't raise her voice, but the whole world heard her." Another said, "Jasmine proved that strength doesn't come from aggression. It comes from truth spoken with grace."
Jasmine, however, didn't bask in the attention. In interviews, she downplayed the drama and focused on the message. She said, "This was never about winning. It was about being heard and about making sure respect goes both ways." Her words reflected not ego, but understanding, a maturity that resonated deeply with people from every background. The moment even began to influence how others in positions of power behaved. Judges, politicians, and leaders across different fields referenced the incident in speeches and panels. It became an example of how confrontation, when handled with grace, could lead to meaningful change rather than chaos. Months later, long after the headlines had faded, that moment still lingered in public consciousness. It was taught in communication workshops and shared in leadership conferences. The story of a judge and a congresswoman, one older and seasoned, the other young and outspoken, had become more than just a viral clip. It had become a lesson in emotional intelligence, courage, and mutual respect. In an age where arguments often turn into shouting matches and social media thrives on division, their story stood as proof that understanding was still possible, that even the strongest voices could coexist if they were willing to listen. And perhaps the most beautiful part of it all was that neither woman had planned for it to happen. It wasn't scripted, rehearsed, or designed for cameras. It was real, raw, human, and genuine. Two women from different generations met in conflict, but left with connection. As one journalist beautifully summarized in her article, it wasn't the argument that defined them, it was the reconciliation. The world saw in Jasmine Crockett the fire of progress, and in Judge Edith Jones the wisdom of reflection. Together, they showed that strength isn't found in who speaks louder, but in who listens deeper. And from that day forward, people remembered not the clash of opinions, but the harmony that followed. The moment when strength met wisdom and respect won.
ChatGPT said, "The news of their private conversation spread faster than anyone could have imagined. What had begun as a heated courtroom moment between Judge Edith Jones and Representative Jasmine Crockett transformed into something entirely unexpected, a lesson in respect, growth, and understanding." When word got out that the two women had met privately after the hearing, social media platforms were flooded with curiosity. People wondered what had been said behind those closed doors. But when bits of the story began to surface, that Judge Jones had apologized and acknowledged Jasmine's determination, it didn't spark outrage, it sparked admiration. Suddenly, the internet wasn't divided into sides. It was united in fascination. The story became bigger than politics or law. It became a story about two powerful women from completely different worlds finding common ground. Across TikTok, Instagram, and X, short clips of their courtroom exchange were being edited side by side with inspiring music. Users captioned it, "The day strength met wisdom," and that phrase quickly went viral. In classrooms, teachers brought up the moment during discussions on leadership and communication. High school debate clubs used it as an example of how disagreement doesn't have to turn into disrespect. One student said, "It's like they showed us that strong opinions and respect can exist in the same room." Podcasters and talk show hosts dissected every second of the exchange. They analyzed Jasmine's calm tone, Judge Jones's initial reaction, and how both women handled themselves afterward. "It's rare," one popular podcast host said, "to see two people so different in background and generation turn a public clash into a private lesson in empathy." For days, the conversation dominated headlines. Hashtags like "Strength meets wisdom," "Leadership with grace," and "The calmest storm" trended worldwide. Commentators praised Jasmine's composure, calling her response the calmest storm ever seen in a courtroom. Her poise had not only silenced a courtroom, but also inspired millions watching at home. But what truly surprised everyone came later. Judge Jones, known for her sharp wit and no-nonsense approach, issued a public statement. It was short, just a few lines, but it carried incredible weight. Leadership isn't about silence or shouting. It's about knowing when to listen and who deserves to be heard. Those words struck a chord far beyond the legal world. They appeared on motivational posters, social media quotes, and even university walls. For many, it was proof that true leadership means having the humility to learn, no matter what your position or age. People began to see the story not as a clash, but as a bridge. It was a moment when wisdom and passion had met halfway, proving that progress isn't made through pride, but through understanding. Even those who had originally taken sides now found themselves admiring both women equally. Behind the scenes, Jasmine continued her work with the same fire she'd always had, but with a newfound sense of appreciation. She often mentioned in interviews how that moment with Judge Jones reminded her that sometimes change begins not by shouting louder, but by being heard clearly. Respect, she said in one interview, isn't something you demand. It's something you earn by standing for truth and showing up with integrity. For Judge Jones, the experience became somewhat of a personal awakening. Those close to her said she often reflected on that hearing as one of the most memorable moments of her career. It reminded her of her own early struggles, the times she had been told to know her place, when all she wanted was to be taken seriously. Watching Jasmine reminded her of the young version of herself, fearless, driven, and unwilling to be silenced. In the months that followed, their story continued to echo across the country. News outlets referred to it as a turning point, a rare example of two strong voices choosing dialogue over ego. Universities invited both women to speak about leadership, empathy, and communication in times of conflict. And though they didn't always agree on everything, they shared a mutual respect that was impossible to ignore. The moment that started as tension ended as transformation. What began with a courtroom challenge ended with a handshake that inspired millions. It reminded people everywhere that strength isn't found in how loudly we speak, but in how deeply we listen. And then that small yet powerful moment between Judge Edith Jones and Jasmine Crockett, the world witnessed something rare. 2 generations, 2 perspectives, 1 lesson. That even in disagreement, respect can lead to understanding, and understanding can lead to change. Their story wasn't about winning or losing. It was about what happens when wisdom meets courage, and both decide to listen.
Weeks later, the story that had once shaken the courtroom found new life in an entirely different setting, a televised forum about justice and equality. The network had invited both Judge Edith Jones and Representative Jasmine Crockett to share their perspectives on leadership, truth, and the state of modern discourse. Viewers expected another verbal showdown, something fiery, maybe even tense. After all, the last time these two women were seen together, their exchange had gone viral worldwide. But when the cameras began rolling, what unfolded wasn't confrontation. It was connection. The lights dimmed, the host introduced them, and the audience waited, holding their breath. Judge Jones sat tall and composed, the picture of authority. Jasmine, poised yet relaxed, carried the same quiet confidence that had won hearts weeks earlier. As the discussion began, both women spoke with honesty and depth, but instead of challenging each other, they began to build on one another's thoughts, layer by layer, like 2 sides of the same coin finally coming together. Then came the moment that stole the show. Judge Jones turned toward Jasmine and said, "You know, Jasmine reminded me that confidence isn't defiance, it's conviction." The audience went silent, almost stunned.
For a judge known for her stern tone and no-nonsense approach, that sentence was more than a compliment. It was an admission of growth. It showed humility, the kind that comes only from deep reflection. Jasmine smiled, her voice calm but filled with warmth. And you reminded me that listening doesn't make you weak, it makes you wiser. The crowd erupted in applause. Even the host, trying to maintain composure, smiled in awe of what was unfolding. Cameras zoomed in on the two women shaking hands again, this time not as a follow-up to conflict, but as a continuation of respect. Their smiles said everything. They weren't opponents anymore. They were allies in a much larger fight, the fight for understanding. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. It dominated timelines, news feeds, and headlines across the world. The same internet that had once divided itself into Team Jones and Team Crockett now celebrated both of them together. The hashtag #RiseTogether started trending, symbolizing unity, respect, and progress. For many, it wasn't just about two women on a stage. It was about what they represented. Two generations of leadership finding common ground. Older viewers admired Judge Jones for showing that strength doesn't fade with age, it evolves. Younger audiences found inspiration in Jasmine's balance of confidence and humility, realizing that you could be bold without being bitter, powerful without being loud. Commentators called it the moment that healed the internet. Talk shows replayed the clip endlessly, analyzing every smile, every glance, every word. It was rare to see such authenticity, two strong personalities choosing empathy over ego in front of millions. Schools began using the clip in communication workshops. Professors cited it in lectures about emotional intelligence and conflict resolution. Even corporate trainers played it during leadership seminars, showing how mutual respect can transform confrontation into collaboration. And once again, just like before, the story reached beyond its original context. People began writing about it, creating essays and think pieces, with titles like When Attitude Met Empathy and Strength Doesn't Have to Shout. Artists painted murals inspired by their handshake, symbolizing dialogue and growth. But perhaps the most powerful impact was the quiet one, the shift in how people began viewing disagreement itself. In an age where arguments often turn toxic, this story reminded everyone that understanding doesn't mean surrendering. You can stand firm in your beliefs and still respect the person standing across from you. Judge Jones later reflected on the event in an interview. Sometimes, she said, life gives you moments that remind you why you started. Jasmine did that for me. She reminded me that justice isn't just about law. It's about heart. Jasmine, too, shared her thoughts a few days later. I didn't expect any of this, she said. But if one young woman out there watches that clip and realizes she can be both strong and kind, then it was all worth it. Their journey from a tense courtroom encounter to a shared stage of mutual respect became a blueprint for what real progress looks like. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about the courage to listen, to learn, and to grow. By the time the lights faded on that televised forum, it was clear that something special had happened. They had turned conflict into connection and criticism into collaboration. In the end, it wasn't Judge Jones's sharp comment or Jasmine's graceful comeback that people remembered. It was their transformation, from tension to trust, from pride to partnership. As one reporter put it perfectly, in that courtroom, attitude didn't meet authority, it met empathy, and what followed was more powerful than any verdict. It was understanding.